Boston, Massachusetts, March 4, 2024, a Tuesday morning. The kind of cold that comes off the harbor and slides under every door, the kind of morning that makes ordinary people do ordinary things, commute, drink coffee, sort through cardboard boxes in the back rooms of archive buildings while the radiators knock and the fluorescent lights hum overhead. Sarah Mitchell had been sorting photographs for 4 hours. She was a curator at the Boston Historical Society, a specialist in 19th-century American photography, a woman who had spent 14 years training herself to look at the faces of dead strangers and understand what they were trying to say. She had examined thousands of photographs, cabinet cards and tintypes, ambrotypes and daguerreotypes. Wealthy families and working-class families and families who had saved for months, in some cases, years, just to afford a single formal portrait so that something of them would survive. She had opened 17 items from a donated estate box that morning before she pulled out the 18th. An 8x10 mounted photograph, cream-colored card stock, gold embossed lettering at the bottom, faded but legible, J. Morrison Studio, Boston, Massachusetts, 1892. She set it under the magnifying lamp. 5 figures stared back at her with the rigid, unsmiling expressions typical of the era. A bearded man in his late 30s, seated in an ornate chair. A woman standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder. 2 boys arranged on either side. And a little girl, maybe 5 years old, maybe 6, standing slightly apart, her hand held inside the woman's, her face serious in the way all children's faces were serious in photographs from this era, when the exposure time demanded stillness and stillness demanded something close to solemnity. Sarah almost moved on to the next item. Instead, and she would spend months afterward unable to fully explain why, she reached for her digital scanner. There was something on the floor beside the man's chair, partially hidden by the shadow of the carved wooden leg, partially tucked under the edge of a decorative rug. She'd initially read it as a trick of studio lighting, but studio lighting didn't make shapes. It didn't make the outline of a small arm, a simple dress, a few loops of yarn. There was a doll on the floor. A worn, handmade, clearly loved cloth doll, tucked almost out of frame, placed where it could only be seen if you were looking for it. Sarah Mitchell scanned the photograph at 1200 dpi. She zoomed in until the image filled her monitor, until she could see the individual fibers of the doll's dress, the uneven loop of its yarn hair, the slight compression of its body where a small hand had held it for years. In 14 years of examining Victorian family portraits, she had never, not once, seen an informal toy placed on the floor of a formal studio sitting. Not like this, not positioned where it would be barely visible, not tucked half under a rug as though someone had placed it there deliberately, meant for it to be seen without wanting it to be the first thing you noticed. Victorian studio photography was not accidental. Every element of a formal portrait, the furniture, the posture, the clothing, the accessories, was intentionally arranged. Studio sessions cost money that working families scraped together over months. No family paid for a formal portrait and then casually allowed a worn child's toy to lie forgotten on the floor. Someone had placed that doll there on purpose. And when Sarah Mitchell began searching the records, the birth certificates and census entries and industrial employment files and school enrollment registers, she discovered something that stopped her cold. The little girl in the photograph did not exist. Not in any official record, not in any ledger. The Harper family, as documented by the City of Boston, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the United States Federal Census, had 2 sons, no daughters. This child, this small, serious-faced girl standing in a formal family portrait, her hand held inside another woman's, had no documented birth, no entry in any register, no paper trail of any kind. Until Sarah Mitchell found the cloth doll, until she found the fire, until she found the name they had given her and the name she'd been born with, and the story that had stayed buried inside a cardboard box in a dead collector's estate for 132 years. What she uncovered in the months that followed was not simply the story of one orphan child rescued by one compassionate family. It was a window into an entire hidden world, the world of informal adoptions, industrial disaster cover-ups, and the extraordinary community networks of silence that allowed working-class families in Boston's mill districts to do for one another what the official institutions of the city refused to do. The little girl's mother had died in a fire that the mill owners never fully answered for. The child had been erased from the public record, and that erasure may have been the very thing that saved her life. This is the story of Anna Sullivan, the girl who wasn't supposed to exist, and the family that refused to let her disappear. Before we go any further into what happened in Boston in the winter of 1891, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Hollow Century right now and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things inside systems that were designed to crush them, these are exactly the stories that get lost, that get donated in cardboard boxes and left in back rooms and almost thrown away. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from. Let us see how far this truth can travel. I'll be here. Now, let's go back to 1891. To understand what happened to Anna Sullivan, you have to understand the world her mother moved through. Not the world of Boston, the tourist city, the golden dome of the State House, the swan boats in the public garden, the brownstones of Beacon Hill. That world existed, but it was a very small world inhabited by a very small number of people. The world Margaret Sullivan lived in was a different city entirely. By 1890, the greater Boston metropolitan area had grown to nearly 450,000 people. The Industrial Revolution had been underway for 40 years, and it had not distributed its benefits evenly. The mills of Waltham, a mill city 8 miles west of Boston, connected to the capital by rail and river, were among the most productive textile operations in the country. The Waltham textile mills employed hundreds of workers, most of them women, most of them Irish immigrants or the daughters of Irish immigrants, most of them living within walking distance of the factory floor in wooden tenement houses that shared walls and privies, and the particular smell of boiled cabbage and coal smoke that marked every working-class neighborhood in industrial New England. The mills ran 6 days a week. Some shifts started at 5 in the morning. The looms were loud enough to cause permanent hearing loss over a working lifetime, and most workers had working lifetimes that began in childhood, when children as young as 10 could be legally employed in Massachusetts factories under the supervision of an adult. The noise was constant, the air was thick with cotton fiber, and the machinery had no safety guards. Hands were lost, fingers were lost. Occasionally, when something went wrong with the boilers, the massive steam pressure vessels that powered the entire operation, people were lost entirely. The mill owners were not unaware of the boiler risk. They were aware of it in the way that men who have never stood next to a boiler are aware of things, theoretically, from a distance from behind a desk. In the 1880s and 1890s, boiler explosions killed approximately 1,400 people per year across the United States. Regulatory oversight was minimal. Inspection schedules were inconsistent. When an explosion occurred, the coroner's inquest was almost always the same: industrial accident, unforeseen, tragic, no criminal liability. The families of the dead received, in most cases, nothing. Margaret Sullivan knew all of this. Every woman who worked those mills knew all of this. They worked anyway because the alternative was destitution, and destitution in 1890 meant the almshouse, and the almshouse was a place you only entered as a last resort. The mills were dangerous, but the mills paid wages, and the wages, carefully managed, could keep a woman and her child in a rented room with food on the table and coal in the stove. This is the tightrope that Margaret Sullivan walked every single day. A widow in a city that offered widows very few options. A mother in an era when the state's primary response to orphaned children was institutionalization. A worker in an industry that treated her body as an industrial input and her death, should it come to that, as an acceptable operating cost. The Waltham textile mill had undergone a rapid expansion in 1889 and 1890. New floors were added, new machinery was installed. The boiler room which powered the entire complex was upgraded, though upgraded was a relative term. The new boilers ran at higher pressures than the old ones. Higher pressure meant more power, more output, more profit. It also meant a smaller margin for error. The maintenance logs for the boiler room in the winter of 1890 to 1891 would later become a subject of significant and contentious scrutiny. But in January of 1891 they were simply paperwork, filed, stamped, forgotten in a cabinet in the mill superintendent's office. Nobody was looking at the maintenance logs the morning of January 18, 1891. Not yet. Margaret Sullivan was 27 years old when she died. She had been born in County Cork, Ireland in 1863, the third of 6 children born to Cormac and Bridget Sullivan. Her father had been a fisherman. Her mother had kept a kitchen garden and taken in mending from the larger houses in the village. Margaret had grown up understanding two things with absolute clarity: that survival required work, and that the world would not come to find you. You had to go out and meet it on its own terms. She had come to Boston in 1882 at the age of 19, with her older sister Kathleen and $23 saved from 2 years of domestic service. She had found work quickly, the mills were always hiring, and within a year she had saved enough to rent her own room. She had sent money home to Cork every month until the letters stopped coming, and she understood that her parents were gone. In 1884, she had met Daniel Sullivan at a church dance organized by St. Mary's Parish in Waltham. Daniel worked on the rail line, not a glamorous job, but a steady one with better safety margins than the mills. They had married in June of 1885 at the same church where they'd met, in a ceremony attended by 63 people whose names Margaret would have been able to recite from memory if you'd asked her, because Margaret was the kind of person who remembered everything. Names, faces, the specific details of specific kindnesses, who had lent her a shawl in the winter of 1882, who had left bread on her doorstep when she was sick, who had watched Anna through a long afternoon when Margaret needed to work. Anna had been born in October of 1886. Margaret had labored for 11 hours in the front room of their tenement apartment, while Kathleen held her hand and the midwife from 3 streets over managed the rest. Daniel had paced the hallway. When they told him it was a girl, he had laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him. Daniel Sullivan died of pneumonia in February of 1889. He had caught a cold that turned into bronchitis, and the bronchitis turned into pneumonia, and the pneumonia did what pneumonia did to poorly housed, undernourished working men in the late 19th century. He was 31 years old. Margaret was 25. Anna was 2. The grief was not a collapse. Margaret did not collapse. She could not afford to collapse. She had a 2-year-old daughter and a rent payment due at the end of the month and no income beyond what she could earn herself. She went back to the mill within 3 weeks. She arranged for a woman named Ellen Carey, a neighbor, a widow herself, a woman of boundless practical charity, to watch Anna during the early morning shift. She was back on the floor at 5 in the morning, 6 days a week, by the 1st of March. She was not bitter about this. That is the most important thing to understand about Margaret Sullivan. She was not a bitter woman. She had been shaped by hard circumstances, but she had not been hardened by them. The women who worked alongside her at the mill remembered her, decades later, as someone who found things to laugh at, not the hollow laugh of someone performing courage, but real laughter. The laughter of a person who had decided that since you were going to spend 10 hours a day in a loud, hot, dangerous building, you might as well find something to enjoy about the people around you. She made the cloth doll for Anna in the autumn of 1890. She made it from scraps, fabric left over from a neighbor's sewing project, yarn unraveled from a worn stocking, buttons from an old coat. She sewed it by lamplight in the evenings after Anna was asleep, and she gave it to her daughter for her 4th birthday in October, and Anna carried it everywhere with the single-minded intensity that 4-year-olds bring to beloved objects. The doll was still in Anna's hands the morning of January 18, 1891, when Margaret kissed her daughter goodbye, tucked her into Ellen Carey's care, and walked to work in the dark. It was cold. She would have felt it, the particular cold of New England in January, the kind that presses against your face and makes your breath visible. She would have walked quickly, her shawl pulled close, thinking of the things she thought about on the walk to work: Anna, the week's expenses, whether the cold snap would break soon, what she would cook for dinner if she got home before dark. She did not know, as she pushed through the mill's front entrance and made her way down to the floor, that the boiler in the basement had been running at irregular pressure for 3 days. She did not know that a maintenance worker had noted a problem with one of the pressure relief valves in a log entry that would later disappear. She did not know that the foreman had been told about the irregularity and had decided it could wait until the weekend. She walked in, she took her position, she began her shift. And at 7:23 in the morning, the boiler exploded. The Waltham textile mills were owned in 1891 by a corporate partnership, the Waltham Manufacturing Company, whose principal shareholders included 3 men whose names appeared regularly in the society pages of the Boston Globe. Harrison Aldrich, 54, a director of 2 banks and a trustee of a prominent charitable organization. Robert Paxton, 61, a former state legislator with homes in Boston and Newport. and William Frost, 48, the operating partner responsible for daily management of the mill complex. These were not monsters. That is the hardest part of stories like this one, and it must be stated directly. These were not monsters. They were businessmen, respected businessmen, men who donated to churches, who sat on hospital boards, who were asked to give eulogies at funerals and toasts at weddings. Men who believed, genuinely believed, that the creation of employment for immigrant workers was itself a form of charity. Men who understood the boiler risk the way they understood all risks, as a line item in a cost-benefit calculation, managed by insurance and managed by law, and therefore not their personal moral responsibility. The law agreed with them. Under Massachusetts law in 1891, the legal doctrine of assumption of risk held that a worker who accepted employment in a known hazardous industry had, by virtue of that acceptance, consented to the ordinary risks of that industry. A textile mill worker who was injured or killed by machinery, fire, or explosion had, in the eyes of the law, assumed that risk as a condition of employment. Liability for the employer attached only in cases of gross negligence, a threshold that was, in practice, nearly impossible to meet, because gross negligence required proving that the employer had known of a specific, imminent danger and had done nothing, and proving that required access to the maintenance logs and inspection records that the employer controlled. The employer also controlled the coroner. Not directly, not with cash in an envelope. The control was more elegant and more durable than bribery. The coroner was an elected official in a city where the mill owners were among the largest employers and the largest political donors. The coroner's jury was drawn from a pool of citizens who were, in many cases, employed by or commercially dependent upon the same industrial interests. The attorneys who represented the families of the dead were outgunned and outfinanced by the attorneys who represented the mill. This is the system that protected Harrison Aldrich, Robert Paxton, and William Frost, not malice, architecture, a legal and political architecture that had been carefully constructed over 40 years to ensure that industrial productivity was not interrupted by the legal claims of dead workers' families. When something went wrong at the mill, the system knew exactly what to do. It had done it many times before. What William Frost did in the days and weeks following the January 18th explosion was not unusual. It was standard. He hired the attorneys first, before the bodies were fully recovered. He had the maintenance logs reviewed by a company official and certain entries clarified. He engaged the insurance adjusters, who moved quickly to quantify the liability and contain it. He made a series of carefully worded public statements expressing grief and regret while specifying no wrongdoing. He arranged for modest payments to the families of 2 of the dead, not the 5 who had actually died, just 2, the ones whose families had hired attorneys. Margaret Sullivan had no attorney. She had no family in Boston beyond her sister Kathleen, who was herself a mill worker and was herself in no position to fund a legal battle. The Boston newspapers covered the explosion in 3 separate articles, each one progressively shorter and progressively less interested in the question of why 5 people had died, and progressively more interested in the mill's announced plan to resume operations within the week. By the end of January, the story was over in the press. The boiler had been replaced. The mill was running again. The Waltham Manufacturing Company had paid out $312 in insurance settlements to the families of 2 of the dead. The other 3 families, Margaret Sullivan included, received nothing. The maintenance log entry noting the faulty pressure relief valve had been, by that point, gone from the records for 11 days. 7:23 a.m., January 18, 1891, the Waltham Textile Mill, lower level. The sound preceded the destruction by a fraction of a second, a sound that the surviving workers would describe in later testimonies variously as a crack, a roar, a thunderclap from inside the building, a noise with no comparison in their experience, something that bypassed the ears and seemed to arrive directly in the chest. Then the pressure wave. The boiler room occupied the northeast corner of the mill's basement level. The explosion took out the wall between the boiler room and the adjacent storage area, sent a section of the ceiling through the floor above, and triggered a fire in the accumulated cotton fiber and machine oil that was, by the nature of the industry, present in every room of a textile mill. The fire moved faster than anyone expected. The internal stairwells, which would have been the primary escape route, became impassable within minutes. Thomas Harper was on the upper floor supervising the morning shift when the explosion occurred. He had been working at the Waltham textile mills for 10 years. He had started as a floor worker at the age of 25 and had earned his way to floor supervisor through a combination of competence and the particular kind of calm that makes certain men indispensable in emergencies. He was not the kind of man who ran from things. This would be relevant in approximately 90 seconds. The first explosion knocked workers off their feet on the floor above. In the initial confusion, before the fire had spread to the upper levels, before the full scope of the disaster was understood, most workers evacuated through the main entrance. They flooded out into the cold January morning, shaking, some of them burned, some of them bleeding from debris, most of them disoriented but alive. Thomas Harper went back in. He went back in 3 times. The Boston newspapers would later document this, somewhat inaccurately attributing to him a heroism that was real but slightly misframed. He was not performing bravery for an audience. He was responding to the information available to him, that the floor below him still had people in it, that the staircases were compromised but not yet fully impassable, that every second of delay narrowed the margin. He brought out 2 workers on his first entry, 3 on his second. On his third, the eastern stairwell collapsed behind him. He escaped through a window on the ground level, burning his left hand badly on the sill, and stood in the cold outside the burning building, unable to go back in. 3 people were still unaccounted for. The mill's water supply was inadequate to fight the fire effectively. The Waltham Fire Company arrived 12 minutes after the explosion and did their best. 5 workers died in the fire that morning. Patrick Brennan, 34, a boiler room maintenance worker. Michael Donovan, 28, a floor worker on the early shift. Catherine Riley, 29, a floor worker. Sean Murphy, 41, a long-serving machine operator who had been at the mill for 17 years. And Margaret Sullivan, 27, a widow with a 4-year-old daughter. Anna Sullivan was at Ellen Carey's apartment 2 streets away when the explosion occurred. She was sitting on the floor with her cloth doll when the distant sound reached the neighborhood, a low, felt-in-the-bone sound that made Ellen Carey put down her mending and go to the window. Anna did not know yet. She would not know for hours. She would not understand fully for years. Dr. James Whitfield, 43, was the attending physician at Waltham City Dispensary, the public medical facility that served the working-class neighborhoods near the Mill District. He arrived at the scene of the explosion approximately 25 minutes after the initial blast, summoned by a runner sent from the mill. Whitfield had been practicing medicine in Waltham for 11 years. He had seen industrial accidents before. He knew what burns looked like, what crush injuries looked like, what happens to a human body when it is exposed to catastrophic industrial force. He was not unprepared in the clinical sense for what he found. What he was not prepared for, and what would stay with him, by his own later account, for the rest of his career, was the conversation he had 3 days after the explosion with the mill's own company inspector. Whitfield had examined the bodies of all 5 dead workers. He had also treated 14 injured workers. In the course of treating those injured workers, he had taken careful notes, not because he expected his notes to become legally significant, but because careful notes were what he always took. He had noted, in particular, the injuries consistent with the blast pattern, which in his professional judgment suggested a concentrated pressure failure originating from a specific point in the boiler assembly, the kind of concentrated failure associated with a defective or improperly maintained pressure relief valve, rather than the general catastrophic failure that would have been consistent with metal fatigue or material defect. He communicated this observation, carefully and professionally, to the company inspector during a meeting, arranged ostensibly to share medical findings for the inquest record. The inspector thanked him for his time. The inquest record, filed 10 days later, characterized the explosion as the result of material defect in the boiler assembly, consistent with metal fatigue, inconsistent with maintenance failure, placing responsibility on the boiler manufacturer rather than the mill's maintenance operation. Whitfield's notes were not included in the inquest record. He had not been asked to submit them. He had not been told they were relevant. This was almost certainly not an accident. He kept the notes anyway. He was a careful man, and careful men keep records. He placed the notes in a file labeled with the date, set the file in the cabinet behind his desk, and continued his practice. He treated mill workers. He attended their births and their deaths and their illnesses. He watched the mill resume operations. He watched the Waltham Manufacturing Company's officers return to their regular social and civic activities. He watched the families of the dead, Margaret Sullivan's sister Kathleen in particular, a young woman whose grief was written in her face for months afterward, navigate the absence left by people who should not have died. He kept the notes. He could not have known in 1891 that those notes would matter, but some people have an instinct for the significance of things that cannot yet be named. Dr. Whitfield was one of those people. He was not alone. Ellen Carey, 38, the neighbor who had been watching Anna Sullivan on the morning of the explosion, was a woman who kept a different kind of record. She kept it in her memory, the way that women who have no access to official record-keeping learn to keep records, meticulously in detail, with dates and names and specific words. She remembered exactly what Margaret Sullivan had said to her 3 days before the explosion. Margaret had come to pick up Anna from an afternoon of minding, and the two women had stood in the hallway for a few minutes talking, the way neighbors do, the way women with difficult lives do when a few minutes of unhurried conversation is itself a small luxury. Margaret had said, they were telling the day shift about the boiler again. Tommy Geary said the valve's been wrong for a week. They said it'd be seen to on Sunday. Ellen Carey remembered those words. She remembered them in 1891, and she remembered them in 1900, and she remembered them in 1920 when she was interviewed as part of a neighborhood oral history project conducted by a local charitable organization. She was 67 years old when she told that story to the young woman with the notebook. She had never told it to anyone with official authority. Because she had learned, in the winter of 1891, what happened when working women brought inconvenient information to the attention of official authority. Nothing happened. Or rather, the wrong things happened. The Waltham Manufacturing Company explosion was not the first industrial disaster in the city. It would not be the last. And in the months following January 18, 1891, a pattern became visible to anyone who was paying attention, a pattern that had nothing to do with the explosion itself and everything to do with what happened afterward to the families of the dead. The mill resumed operations on January 26, 8 days after the explosion. 5 workers were dead, 14 were injured, several seriously. The repair costs were covered by the company's insurance. The production schedule was maintained. Within a month, the mill was running at full capacity. The families of the dead had each received a visit from a company representative in the days after the explosion. The visits were described by the recipients as courteous and sympathetic. The company representative expressed the company's condolences. He explained the insurance process. He presented, in some cases, a document, 2 pages, formal letterhead, dense language, that the bereaved widow or parent was invited to sign in exchange for a payment of between $75 and $156. The document, if signed, would constitute a full release of all claims against the Waltham Manufacturing Company. Patrick Brennan's wife did not sign. She had a brother-in-law who had worked as a courthouse clerk and who read the document and told her in clear terms what it meant. She was the only family member who did not sign. She retained an attorney. The case went to court in September of 1892. The jury, 8 men, all of them employed in commercial or industrial capacities, none of them mill workers, found in favor of the Waltham Manufacturing Company. The judge, in his instructions to the jury, had emphasized the doctrine of assumption of risk with particular clarity. The Brennan family received nothing. Margaret Sullivan's sister Kathleen had signed the release in the second week of February for $89, less than 3 weeks of Margaret's wages. She was not a weak woman for signing. She was a woman with no legal training, no money, no one to read the document for her, and a grief so fresh that she could barely function. She signed because the man who brought the paper was courteous and soft-spoken, and because $89 was real and immediate, and she needed to bury her sister. The attorney fees would have been theoretical. But this is the pattern that matters, not the explosion itself, the pattern of what followed. Because the mill explosion was not an isolated event, the Waltham Manufacturing Company experienced 4 other workplace accidents between 1885 and 1895 that resulted in worker deaths or serious injuries. The pattern in each case was identical. inquest, unforeseen accident, verdict, rapid return to operations, family settlement documents, releases signed under duress, minimal or no press coverage after the initial report. The Brennan case was the only one that ever reached a courtroom. It lost. And Margaret Sullivan's case never reached a courtroom at all, because Margaret Sullivan was dead, and her sister was grieving, and her daughter was 4 years old, and had no one to advocate for her. This is the pattern that Dr. James Whitfield observed from his position at the dispensary. He had treated workers from 4 of the 5 accidents. He had filed medical reports with the City Health Office. Those reports were received, logged, and filed in sequence. No action was taken on any of them. He had by this point begun doing something that went beyond careful note-taking. He had begun keeping a parallel file, a private one, maintained at his home rather than the dispensary, containing not just his own records but newspaper clippings, names, dates, the specific details of each incident and its official resolution. He was building, methodically, and without any immediate intention, the kind of dossier that a lawyer or a journalist would need if someone ever decided to look seriously at the Waltham Manufacturing Company's safety record. No one did, not in 1891, not in 1892. The file sat in a cabinet in Dr. Whitfield's home study, and the mill kept running, and the looms kept turning, and the workers kept arriving at 5 in the morning in the cold and the dark. But somewhere in all of this machinery, somewhere in the gap between the official record and the truth, a 4-year-old girl was carrying a cloth doll through the wreckage of her life, waiting for someone to see her. If you are still with us, and I need you to stay with us, because this story is only getting darker before it gets better, make sure you are subscribed to Hollow Century and have that notification bell turned on. What we are uncovering tonight has been buried under 132 years of institutional silence, of official records that told partial truths and full lies, of a system that was very good at making sure certain deaths stayed forgotten. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that industrial accident is sometimes a legal category, not a factual one. Now, back to Waltham, 1891, and the girl that no official record would admit existed. Sarah Mitchell's investigation began, as most archival investigations begin, with a name and a gap. She had the name Harper, from the Morrison Studio records, from the 1892 appointment book with its neat handwritten entry, Thomas and Elizabeth Harper, family portrait, 5 subjects, payment received, $350. She had the gap. The birth records for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the 1880s showed 2 children born to Thomas and Elizabeth Harper. James, born 1884, Robert, born 1886, no daughter, no Anna. The family photograph clearly contained 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, approximately 5 to 6 years old in November of 1892. The girl was there. The records said she wasn't. The kind of gap between what a photograph shows and what the official record contains is, in archival work, not automatically suspicious. Records were incomplete in the 19th century. Births were sometimes never registered, particularly among immigrant families, particularly among families that moved frequently. There were many innocent explanations for a child who appeared in a photograph but not in a birth register. But Sarah Mitchell had been doing this work for 14 years, and the innocent explanations are usually the ones you find first. You find the birth registration from a different county. You find the baptism record. You find the earlier census entry. The child materializes out of the records in short order because innocent gaps are usually just administrative oversights, and administrative oversights leave a trail. Sarah spent 3 days with the birth records, then the baptism records, then the health department files, then the adoption petitions, which were rare in this era and which she had checked almost as an afterthought and which contained nothing. The girl was not there. She turned to the mill records. The Waltham Textile Mill employment files were housed at the Boston City Archives in the Industrial History section, leather-bound ledgers and manila folders containing the documented working lives of hundreds of men and women who had moved through the mill district at the end of the 19th century. They were in their way remarkable documents. Employment evaluations, payroll entries, disciplinary records, a handful of internal communications. The paper residue of lives spent in service to machinery. Thomas Harper's file was substantial. 10 years of evaluations uniformly positive. A note from 1889 written by the mill superintendent describing Harper as one of the most reliable supervisors on the floor, well respected by his workers and capable of maintaining order and production in difficult circumstances. An entry from 1891 that Sarah initially scanned past and then went back to. A newspaper clipping filed between two quarterly reports. Tragedy at Waltham Mill, 5 dead in boiler room fire. She read the article, she read the names of the dead. And then she read the final line. Mrs. Sullivan leaves behind a daughter, age 4, whose whereabouts and care remain uncertain. She sat back from the table. She did the arithmetic. Margaret Sullivan's daughter, born around 1887, would have been 4 years old in January of 1891. In November of 1892, she would have been 5, approximately the age of the girl in the photograph. Thomas Harper, who had been the supervising floor manager during the explosion, who had entered the burning building 3 times to pull workers out, who had been named repeatedly in newspaper accounts of the rescue efforts. Thomas Harper had been there when Margaret Sullivan died. The connection was there, but Sarah needed more than arithmetic, she needed documentation. She spent the next week working through every institutional record she could find. Orphanage admission registers for 1891, the Home for Little Wanderers, the Boston Female Asylum, the House of the Angel Guardian. She looked for a girl age 4 admitted in the weeks after the January 18th fire. She found nothing. No child matching the description had been placed in any formal institution. The child had not gone to an orphanage. Sarah pulled the 1892 school enrollment records for the Cedar Street Primary School, the school serving the neighborhood where the Harper family lived. And there, in the enrollment register for the 1892-1893 school year, she found what she was looking for. James Harper, age 8, Robert Harper, age 6, Anna Harper, age 5. Anna Harper. The name appeared nowhere in the city's birth records, nowhere in the pre-1892 census data. But she was enrolled in school as a Harper. She was being raised as a Harper. She had materialized officially in the Harper household sometime in the year and a half between the fire and the school enrollment, a quiet, undocumented transfer of a life from one family to another. Sarah Mitchell drove to Waltham on a Thursday morning to speak with the volunteers at the local historical society. She was looking for oral testimony, the kind of memory that doesn't leave a paper trail. Dorothy was in her 70s, with silver hair and the particular briskness of someone who has spent decades being the only person who cares properly about something. She ran the Waltham Historical Society's research library almost single-handedly. She knew where everything was. She had opinions about archival methodology. And she had, in a filing cabinet in the back room, a binder of transcribed oral history interviews conducted between 1970 and 1985 with elderly Waltham residents who had grown up in the Mill District. She laid it on the table in front of Sarah without being asked. "You mentioned the 1891 fire in your email," she said. "That tragedy left deep scars. Many families lost someone. If you're looking for the human record of what happened, it's going to be in here." Sarah worked through the transcripts for 3 hours. Most of the accounts dealt with working conditions, daily life, the rhythms of the Mill District. The interviewees had been children in the 1890s, born in the years immediately before or after the explosion, and their knowledge of the fire itself was largely second-hand, transmitted from parents and neighbors in the decades afterward. But second-hand knowledge, carefully preserved in living memory and accurately transcribed, can carry weight that official documents cannot. In an interview conducted in 1979 with a woman identified as Helen, born 1895, Sarah found a passage that made her breath catch. The interviewer had asked Helen about the families she remembered from her childhood on Cedar Street. Helen had talked about the neighborhood with the detailed affection of someone who had loved it well. Then she said, "The Harpers lived 2 houses down from us. Mr. Harper was well-liked, a fair supervisor, my father always said. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. My mother told me the girl wasn't theirs by birth, but they loved her just the same." Mother said Mrs. Harper's heart broke for the child after her real mother died in the terrible fire. They took her in when others wouldn't. Nobody talked about it much in those days. You didn't pry into such things, but everyone knew, and everyone respected them for it. Everyone knew. The community had been aware for decades that Anna Harper was not the couple's biological daughter. They had chosen to protect the family's privacy, to allow a child to grow up without the weight of her origins defining her, without the legal and social complications that might have attached to a formally acknowledged adoption, without the kind of public scrutiny that could have drawn the attention of authorities who might have decided they had better plans for an orphaned child. The silence of Cedar Street was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of a community that understood what compassion required and what the official systems of the era were capable of doing to children who had no one to protect them. Sarah spoke to Dorothy for a long time that afternoon. Dorothy explained what she had learned over decades of working with these records. Formal adoptions were expensive, complicated, and uncommon in the 1890s, she said. For working-class families, the informal arrangement was the norm. You took in the neighbor's child, you gave her a name, you enrolled her in school, you raised her. The community accepted it. As long as everyone who needed to know did know and everyone else stayed quiet, the arrangement held. What they could not risk was official scrutiny. Why not? Because if the authorities became involved, the child would have been placed in an institution. That was the law's preference. And conditions in those institutions were, she paused, not good. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what the orphanage meant. Taking the child in privately was safer, for her. Sarah drove back to Boston in the late afternoon, watching the winter light fade over the Waltham Hills. She had the name, she had the connection, she had the community's memory. Now she needed to know what happened next. The story of what the Harper family did for Anna Sullivan is, at its core, a story of resistance. Not the dramatic headline-generating kind, no petitions, no marches, no public confrontations. The quieter, more durable kind, the kind that does its work over years and decades, the kind that leaves no evidence of itself until someone 132 years later finds a photograph with a cloth doll tucked almost out of frame. Thomas Harper had stood outside the burning mill on the morning of January 18, 1891, with a burned hand and 3 dead people he had failed to save. He had known Margaret Sullivan. He had supervised her floor. He had known, the way supervisors know things about the people who work under them, that she was a widow, that she had a young daughter, that she was one of those workers whose departure from the floor would leave an identifiable gap in the fabric of the place. The question of what responsibility he felt is not one the historical record answers directly, but the historical record answers it indirectly, in the decision he and Elizabeth made in the weeks after the fire, a decision that would have required conversation, negotiation, the weighing of financial strain and social risk, and the genuine complication of adding a traumatized 4-year-old child to a household with 2 boys under the age of 7. They took her in. This was not costless. The Harper family's income in 1891 was Thomas's supervisor's salary, comfortable by working-class standards, but not expansive. A 3rd child meant more food, more clothing, more coal, more space. The tenement at 47 Cedar Street was not large. And the social complexity was real. People would ask questions, people would form opinions, and the specific questions and opinions of neighbors, employers, and church officials in 1891 were not things that could be dismissed. They took her in anyway, and then they did something that was, in its quiet way, more radical than the act of taking her in. They integrated her. They did not raise Anna Sullivan as a boarder, a charity case, a ward, a foundling. They raised her as their daughter. They gave her their name not with legal formality but with the full weight of daily life. She was Anna Harper. She ate dinner with the family. She slept under the same roof in the same household with the same expectations and the same affections as James and Robert. When the time came for school enrollment, Thomas Harper walked to the Cedar Street Primary School and enrolled all 3 of his children. The registrar asked no questions. He offered no explanations. Anna was 5 years old. She carried the cloth doll her mother had made for her. Elizabeth Harper made a decision that was specific and deliberate, and that Sarah Mitchell would not fully understand until she had read the 1979 oral history interview twice. Elizabeth never took the doll from Anna, never suggested the doll be put away, grown out of, set aside. The doll went where Anna went. It sat on Anna's bed. It was present in the household as a material fact, an artifact of the life that had preceded the Harper family, and its presence was not discussed, but it was also never denied. The doll in the photograph was not accidental. It was not something that slipped into the frame while no one was looking. Victorian portrait photography was, as Sarah had established, a deliberate art form. Every element of a formal portrait was arranged: the furniture, the clothing, the posture, the accessories. A studio session at J. Morrison's studio cost $350, more than 3 months of a working man's wages. Nothing in that frame was accidental. Someone, Elizabeth Harper almost certainly, had placed the doll beside the chair where it could be seen but not immediately noticed. A quiet acknowledgement, an act of memory, a way of saying to any future person who looked closely enough, she was here before us and we know it and we honor it. In 1891, there was no legal mechanism to protect the informal arrangement the Harpers had made. If the Waltham Manufacturing Company's legal team had taken an interest in Margaret Sullivan's daughter, if some administrator had decided that the existence of a surviving minor created a complicating liability, the arrangement could have been challenged. If the city's charity board had discovered that a worker's orphan child was living with a family that had no legal claim to her, they could have intervened. The protection was community silence. Ellen Carey did not speak about where Anna had gone to anyone with official authority. The neighbors on Cedar Street did not speak. The congregation at St. Mary's Church did not speak. The women who had worked alongside Margaret Sullivan at the mill did not speak. They closed ranks. This was not passive, active silence maintained over months and years among dozens of people, many of whom had their own complicated relationships with the mill, the church, the city's charity apparatus, is an act of collective will. It is a choice made and renewed every time someone asks a question and chooses not to answer it fully. And it worked. Anna Harper grew up. She went to school. She learned to read and write and sew and manage a household. She knew at some level that could not be precisely described that there had been a life before the Harpers. The doll told her so. The way Elizabeth sometimes paused when certain subjects came up told her so. The particular care with which Thomas Harper treated her, not different from the care he showed his sons, but somehow more deliberate, told her so. She never spoke about it publicly. She kept the doll her entire life. The Waltham Manufacturing Company's management of the aftermath of the January 18th explosion was efficient, thorough, and largely successful for over a century. The coroner's inquest, conducted in late January 1891, recorded its verdict in 4 sentences: accidental death caused by boiler failure of industrial origin, no criminal negligence established, case closed. The inquest was conducted over 2 days. 3 witnesses testified. The mill's company attorney was present. None of the injured workers were called to give testimony. Dr. Whitfield was not called to give testimony. The official narrative was settled before it was written. The Waltham Daily Tribune covered the explosion in its January 19th edition, with a front-page article and a photograph of the damaged building. The January 20th edition contained a follow-up on the funerals. The January 22nd edition contained a brief item about the company's repair plans. By January 25th, the Waltham textile mill had disappeared from the Tribune's pages entirely. This was not a conspiracy of editorial suppression in the dramatic sense. The Tribune was not threatened, its editors were not bribed. What happened was subtler and more durable. The mill was the largest employer in the city. Its principal shareholders were among the Tribune's most significant advertisers. The paper covered industrial accidents the way it covered industrial accidents, as events, not as patterns. The death of 5 workers was an event. A reporting investigation into the maintenance failures that caused the explosion, sustained over months, at the risk of antagonizing the company and its legal team, was not a story that the Tribune's editors believed served their readers or their business interests, and so it was not a story they told. The maintenance logs, the specific logbook entries that would have documented the faulty pressure relief valve, the unresolved maintenance order, the foreman's decision to defer repair until the weekend, these were never produced at the inquest. They were not requested, they were not subpoenaed. They existed or had existed in a cabinet in the mill superintendent's office. After the explosion, in the days when the building was damaged and personnel were scrambling, the cabinet was accessed by mill management staff for the purpose of assessing and documenting losses. What emerged from that process was a set of logs that, on examination, contained no entries of concern in the days prior to January 18th. Whether the problematic entries were removed, altered, or simply never existed in the form that Tommy Geary, The maintenance worker who had mentioned the valve to Margaret Sullivan 3 days before her death believed they existed, is something the historical record cannot definitively resolve. Ellen Carey's memory of Margaret Sullivan's words was preserved in an oral history interview. Tommy Geary's own memories, if he had any that he ever expressed to anyone, were never recorded. What was recorded, filed, and preserved as the official account was material defect, unforeseen failure, no negligence, no liability. The families signed their release forms, the case was closed, the mill ran. Dr. Whitfield continued practicing medicine in Waltham for another 23 years, treating the workers from the same mill, filing medical reports with the same city health office that filed them and forgot them. He retired in 1914. He died in 1921. His private file, the parallel dossier he had been maintaining since 1891, containing his own medical notes, newspaper clippings, his careful documentation of 4 incidents in which mill workers had been injured or killed under circumstances he believed were preventable, went into a box with the rest of his papers, donated to the Waltham Historical Society by his estate. The file sat in a cabinet in the Historical Society's archive for 43 years. No one opened it. We're past the halfway point of this story, and if you haven't subscribed to Hollow Century yet, this is the moment to do it. What you've just heard, the inquest, the release forms, the maintenance logs that disappeared, this is the history that gets removed. Not with drama, not with fire in the night, but with cabinets and forms and attorneys in quiet rooms making decisions that never make the newspaper. Hit that like button, leave us a comment. Tell us what you think of the people who kept their silence to protect Anna, because the second half of this story, where we follow a child through 76 more years of life, and where a cloth doll in a cardboard box finally breaks open a 132-year-old truth, that's where this story pays off everything it has asked you to carry. Stay with us. The justice in this story does not arrive in a courtroom. There is no dramatic reversal, no trial, no verdict that redeems the 5 people who died on January 18, 1891. That justice never came. The Waltham Manufacturing Company was never held legally accountable for the deaths. The maintenance logs that may have documented foreseeable negligence were never produced in any legal proceeding. Harrison Aldrich, Robert Paxton, and William Frost lived out their lives in comfort and civic respectability. The coroner's verdict stood. This is true, it must be stated directly, because these stories of suppressed truth and buried history, can be dishonest in a particular way, by implying that justice was always somewhere on its way if you waited long enough. Sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes the system that built the problem also managed the aftermath, and the aftermath was impunity. But there is a different kind of justice in this story, and it arrives in a hospital in Arlington, Massachusetts, on a spring morning in 1967. Anna Harper Mitchell was 80 years old. She was in her daughter Margaret's house, and her daughter and her grandchildren were with her, and she had lived a full and specific and irreplaceable life. 61 years of marriage, 4 children, 13 grandchildren, and in the last year of her life, a great-grandchild she had held in her own hands. She had worked as a seamstress for 15 years before her children were born, and she had made things with her hands her entire life, the way women who learn to work early tend to continue working because the work is itself a form of thinking. She had a reputation in her family for 2 things, extreme competence and extreme privacy. She did not discuss herself. She listened carefully and remembered everything. She died in April of 1967, natural causes. The death certificate listed her parents as Thomas and Elizabeth Harper. It listed her birthplace as Boston, Massachusetts. It did not list the name Margaret Sullivan. But the cloth doll was on the shelf in her daughter's house, in the room where Anna had spent her final months. The same cloth doll, the same simple construction, the same yarn hair, the same small tear in the dress fabric that had been there as long as anyone could remember. The justice, partial, symbolic, real, comes in what happened after Sarah Mitchell found the photograph. It comes in the meeting she arranged with Patricia, Anna's granddaughter, the daughter of Thomas Mitchell, who arrived at a Cambridge cafe carrying a worn leather portfolio and the cloth doll wrapped in tissue paper, who had kept both without knowing why, who had known her grandmother's past was complicated in a way that was never discussed. And then it comes in the family meeting. 17 people gathered in Patricia's living room in Cambridge. grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren, the youngest members of a family that had grown from a single act of compassion in 1891. Sarah presented her findings: the fire, the death, the doll, the photograph, the enrollment record, the census entries, the school register, the oral history testimony from Cedar Street, the chain of evidence that connected a 4-year-old girl in January 1891 to the woman whose photograph stood on Patricia's mantelpiece. The room was silent for a long time after she finished. Then an elderly man in the front row, one of Anna's grandsons, raised his hand. "Did she know?" he asked. "Did my grandmother know she was adopted?" Sarah paused. She had thought carefully about how to answer this question. "Based on the evidence," she said, "I believe she did. The doll, the way it was placed in the photograph, that wasn't something a child would have arranged. That was a choice Elizabeth Harper made to include a record of where Anna had come from in a form that Anna herself could see and understand. Whether the full story was ever told to her in words, I can't say. But she kept that doll for 76 years. She knew it was significant." Patricia was holding the cloth doll in her hands. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "She was loved twice," she finally said, "by her birth mother who made this, and by the Harpers who let her keep it." That sentence is not the verdict of a court. It does not undo the deaths in the boiler room. It does not name the maintenance failure, does not hold William Frost accountable, does not rewrite the coroner's inquest. But it is a form of justice, the kind that requires 132 years and a cardboard box and a curator with a magnifying lamp on a cold Tuesday morning. It says she was here, she mattered, the truth of her survived. Anna Harper was enrolled at Cedar Street Primary School in September 1892. She attended through the lower grades alongside her brothers James and Robert. The school records, which Sarah found incomplete but partially legible, showed her attendance as consistent and her performance as adequate, the standard phrasing for a working-class child in 1890s Boston who did what was expected of her and attracted no particular attention from her teachers. The 1900 federal census found the Harper family still at 47 Cedar Street. Thomas, now 45, still employed at the Waltham Textile Mill, which had continued operating under new ownership following the death of Robert Paxton in 1897 without significant change to its labor practices or safety procedures. Elizabeth, 42, James, 16, working as a mill apprentice, Robert, 14, still in school, and Anna Harper, age 13, listed as daughter. No asterisk, no qualification, daughter. She was, by that point, simply Anna Harper, not Anna Sullivan Harper, not Anna Harper formerly Sullivan, Anna Harper, full stop. The community's decade of protective silence had done its work. The story of where she had come from was known to the people who needed to know it, and invisible to the institutions that might have complicated it. Thomas Harper retired from the mill in 1909, having worked there for nearly 30 years. He died in 1915 at the age of 60 of a heart condition. Elizabeth survived him by 11 years, dying in 1926 at 78. Their obituaries in the Waltham and Boston papers mentioned their surviving children, James, Robert, and Anna, their daughter. Anna had married Joseph Mitchell in June of 1912 at St. Mary's Church in Waltham, the same church where her birth mother had occasionally attended services 20 years before, though Anna would not have known this. She was 25 years old. Joseph was 27, a postal clerk, a steady man with a reliable income and a quality that Anna appears to have valued highly. He did not require excessive explanation. They moved to Cambridge. They had 4 children: Catherine in 1913, Margaret in 1915, Thomas in 1917, and Elizabeth in 1921, named, those last 2, for the people who had given Anna a second beginning. The 4 children of Anna and Joseph Mitchell grew up knowing their mother as a woman of few words about the past and many words about the present. She was capable, organized, possessed of a dry humor that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. She made things with her hands. She kept a precise house. She attended church with the committed but undemonstrative religiosity of someone for whom faith was structural rather than ornamental. She kept the cloth doll on a shelf in her bedroom. When her grandchildren asked about it, she said it was very special, that it had belonged to someone she had loved very much. She did not elaborate, she did not need to. Anna Harper Mitchell died in April of 1967 at the age of 80 at her daughter Margaret's house in Arlington. She was survived by her 4 children, 13 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Her death certificate listed her occupation as seamstress, her birthplace as Boston, her parents as Thomas and Elizabeth Harper. Of the people who had shaped the circumstances of her early life, William Frost, the operating manager of the Waltham Manufacturing Company, died in 1908. His obituary praised his contributions to the textile industry and his charitable giving. No reference was made to the boiler explosion of 1891. Harrison Aldrich died in 1914. Robert Paxton in 1897. Their estates were distributed to their heirs. No legal judgment was ever entered against the Waltham Manufacturing Company in connection with the deaths of January 18, 1891. Tommy Geary, the maintenance worker who had told Margaret Sullivan about the faulty valve, continued working at the mill until 1903, when he left for reasons the record does not specify. His subsequent history was not traced by any researcher until Sarah Mitchell, following a hunch, located him in the 1910 census in Providence, Rhode Island, working as a handyman living alone. He died in 1919 of influenza during the pandemic. He left no will and no oral record of what he knew. Ellen Carey, who had been watching Anna on the morning of the explosion, and who had preserved in memory Margaret Sullivan's words about the boiler valve, lived to be 81. She was interviewed by the Oral History Project in 1982, 9 months before her death. She was the last living person who had known Margaret Sullivan. Her testimony, transcribed and preserved in the binder that Dorothy pulled from the filing cabinet for Sarah Mitchell, is the only surviving first-person account of anything Margaret Sullivan ever said. Kathleen Sullivan, Margaret's sister, continued working at the Waltham Mill for another 6 years after the explosion. She married in 1897, moved to Providence, raised 3 children. She and Anna maintained an intermittent correspondence through the 1920s and 1930s. Whether Kathleen ever told her own children who Anna was, whether the Sullivan line ever fully understood the connection, is something the historical record does not resolve. Dr. James Whitfield's private file, maintained from 1891 until his retirement in 1914, was donated to the Waltham Historical Society in 1921 and sat in an archive cabinet for 43 years. The file had a label, a plain manila folder, handwritten in a precise 19th-century hand, Industrial Accident Cases, Waltham Manufacturing Co., 1885-1914, J. E. Whitfield, M.D. It was discovered in 1964 by a graduate student named Thomas Harrington, who was writing a thesis on public health administration in industrial Massachusetts for Boston University. He had been granted access to the Waltham Historical Society's archive for a day of general research, and he had pulled the Whitfield papers because the name appeared in a footnote in a 1910 public health report he had been using as a source. He opened the folder. He read through it quickly, as graduate students under time pressure do. He noted the medical documentation, the newspaper clippings, the carefully organized chronological record that Dr. Whitfield had maintained over 23 years. He made several pages of notes. He wrote a paragraph in his thesis acknowledging Dr. Whitfield's documentation as evidence of the inadequacy of city health oversight in this period. And then he put the folder back in the cabinet. He did not investigate the specific incidents documented. He did not cross-reference the maintenance log entries, the ones Dr. Whitfield had documented in his private notes based on conversations with injured workers, against the coroner's inquest records. He did not note the discrepancy between what Dr. Whitfield's medical notes suggested about the cause of the 1891 explosion and what the official record recorded. He was a graduate student writing about public health administration, not industrial negligence, and the story of why 5 specific people had died on January 18, 1891, was adjacent to his subject but not his subject. The folder went back in the cabinet. The thesis was completed in 1966. It made no mention of the Waltham Manufacturing Company's boiler explosion by name. The folder remained in the cabinet for another 60 years. Sarah Mitchell found it in April of 2024, 6 weeks after she found the Harper family portrait. She had gone to Waltham specifically to speak with Dorothy about the oral history collection, and Dorothy, who knew her archive the way some people know their gardens, had mentioned the Whitfield papers almost as an afterthought. "There's a collection from an old dispensary doctor. He kept records on mill accidents. You might find some context there. Sarah opened the folder on a table in the Society's reading room and read it in its entirety in 2 hours of complete silence. Dr. Whitfield's notes on the 1891 explosion were meticulous. His medical analysis of the blast injuries was consistent with concentrated pressure failure from a specific point, the conclusion he had communicated unrecorded to the company inspector in 1891. His private note, written in January 1891 and filed at the front of the relevant section, read, "Multiple workers report maintenance concerns with relief valve in days prior. No official record of same appears to have been preserved. Blast pattern consistent with valve failure. Official verdict, material defect. I do not believe this account is complete." He had not said who told him about the maintenance concerns. He may have been protecting his sources, or he may simply have believed that medicine was his domain and accusation was someone else's. But the note existed. The notes, all 23 years of them, existed. They had existed through the period when the Waltham Manufacturing Company settled its insurance claims, through the period when the coroner's verdict was entered and the records were filed, through the period when every other avenue of accountability was closed. They survived because Dr. James Whitfield was a careful man who believed that records should be kept, even when no one was looking at them. Sarah included a full summary of the Whitfield file in the archival report she prepared for the Boston Historical Society. The report documented the full evidentiary chain: the photograph, the doll, the birth records gap, the school enrollment, the oral history testimony from Cedar Street, the mill records, and the Whitfield file. She attached copies of every document. The report was accessioned into the Boston Historical Society's permanent collection in the summer of 2024. The Harper family portrait and the cloth doll were placed on exhibit together, connected by a text panel explaining everything Sarah had found. The exhibit was titled, "Beside the Chair, One Family's Act of Compassion and the Fire That Made It Necessary." The Whitfield file was cited in a footnote. It was the first time in 133 years that the words valve failure and Waltham Manufacturing Company appeared in any publicly accessible document alongside the date January 18, 1891. What happened to Margaret Sullivan and the 4 other workers who died in the Waltham Mill fire was not unusual. That is the most important sentence in this story, and it must land fully before we go any further. It was not unusual. The Waltham textile mill explosion of 1891 was one of approximately 1,400 industrial boiler fatalities in the United States that year. The systematic legal mechanisms that protected the Waltham Manufacturing Company from accountability, assumption of risk doctrine, inadequate inspection regimes, coroner's juries selected from commercially dependent citizens, release forms pressed upon grieving families before the funerals were over, these mechanisms were not specific to Waltham or to Massachusetts. They were the architecture of industrial America. They were how the system was designed to work, and they worked. The 5 workers who died on January 18, 1891 were not killed by monsters. They were killed by businessmen who had made economic calculations and by a legal system that had been constructed over 40 years to ensure that those calculations would face no consequence. The maintenance log entry that documented the faulty valve, if it ever existed in the form that Tommy Geary believed it did not survive because survival would have been costly. The coroner's verdict was what it was because the coroner's jury was composed of men whose livelihoods were intertwined with the industries they were supposed to oversee. This is the system working as designed. What we owe to the memory of Margaret Sullivan is not only grief. Grief is easy. What we owe her is precision, the specific understanding of which gears turned, which documents were filed, which signatures were obtained, which records were absent from which cabinets. Because precision is what turns a tragedy into a lesson. And the lesson here is not that bad things happen to good people. The lesson is that bad things are made to happen to good people by systems that are carefully built and carefully maintained, and very, very good at making themselves invisible. The system that killed Margaret Sullivan in 1891 was not a secret. It was in the statutes. It was in the court opinions. It was in the insurance manuals and the corporate charters and the editorial policies of newspapers that depended on industrial advertising. The only people to whom it was invisible were the people it was designed to harm. And yet Anna Sullivan did not disappear. A community of ordinary people, a supervisor who went back into a burning building, a woman who opened her home, a neighborhood that chose silence over information, preserved one life out of the 5 that were destroyed that January morning. 17 people sat in Patricia's living room in Cambridge and heard the story of their great-grandmother for the first time. They heard the name Margaret Sullivan. They heard about the cloth doll and the fire and the morning of January 18th and the 11 hours of labor and the walk to the mill in the cold and the last ordinary thought before the boiler failed. They know now, that family knows now. Anna Harper Mitchell spent 76 years carrying the one material object that connected her to her first life. She never explained it. She never needed to. She understood in whatever wordless way children understand the things that are carried for them, that the doll was her first mother's love made physical, and that the family who had let her keep it was a different kind of love, just as real. Both things were true. Both things survived. I want to ask you 3 questions before we close tonight. The first, what do you think Ellen Carey was doing when she kept Margaret Sullivan's words about the boiler valve in her memory for over 90 years, never telling anyone with official authority? Was that protection, or was that a failure? There is no clean answer. I'd like to hear yours. The second, Thomas and Elizabeth Harper took in Anna Sullivan at real financial and social cost, with no legal protection and no guarantee of any outcome. They just did it because it was there to be done. How many moments like that exist in every generation, moments where someone could become the person who changes a life's trajectory, that don't get taken because the cost is visible and the consequence is not. The third, the Whitfield file sat in a cabinet in Waltham for 60 years. The cloth doll sat on a shelf in Anna Mitchell's bedroom for 76 years. The photograph sat in a cardboard box in a dead collector's estate until a curator on a cold Tuesday morning in March 2024 reached for the scanner instead of the next item. What else is waiting? What truth, carefully preserved by someone who understood its significance without knowing its future, is sitting right now in a cabinet or a box or a back room, waiting for the right person to look closely enough? Subscribe to Hollow Century so you never miss a story. Hit that notification bell because we are just getting started pulling things out of cabinets and back rooms and sealed archives that the powerful would prefer to remain sealed. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that history is not a finished document. It is an argument ongoing between the comfortable version and the true one. And the true one, given enough time and enough people who refuse to stop looking, always finds a way to survive. Anna Sullivan survived. Her mother's doll survived. The truth survived. I'll see you in the next one.